Okay, so we will get started here this morning. First, thank you so much for joining with us today. My name is Dottie Vance, and I'll be taking you through today's training session. I'm joined virtually on the call by some of my colleagues who may speak up during our designated Q&A portion to provide clarity when needed about the topic to discuss. In addition, I have my producer on the call, Mo, who's going to help navigate today's questions, help as we go through. If there's any technical difficulties, she's here to help. We're here to talk today about the changes being implemented as part of the Transmission Service and Market Scheduling Priorities, Phase 2, Track 1, that daily process. To increase transparency and provide greater service to our stakeholders, we are going to be recording this webinar. It will be posted to our website sometime after today's call, so you can review it in the future, or for those who may not be able to join the call this morning. These slides are posted on the Learning Center under New Modules on the ISO website. We'll also be posting a link in the chat. I see that Mo just did that. Thank you so much, Mo. It's also posted on the Release Planning page, and you can find these slides also housed on the Policy Initiative page. So those are those other locations. So today, before we jump into the training, I just want to talk about some housekeeping. So the first thing is to remain muted unless you're asking a question. This is just going to help with background noise and making sure things run smoothly this morning. Speaking of questions, if you have questions, you have two avenues to go down. You can either put your question in the chat, and when we get to that stopping point, we'll read it out loud and get you an answer. Or you can use the raised hand icon, and you can raise your hand, alerting us that you have a question, and we'll call on you to unmute and verbally ask that question. So now that we laid out the housekeeping, let's go into the agenda for today's training. So we do have an hour and a half together. We'll probably wrap up sooner, but I did want to make sure we had enough buffer time in case folks have questions and just really get into this as we're meeting this morning. So today we're going to be recapping what we talked about for the monthly process. So that happened last month. We met and talked about that. We're also going to walk through the new stuff. So understand the application specific details for the daily process. And then we want to make sure that you leave here today ready for market simulation and readiness activities that follow. Again, just to level set, I did include an acronym slide here for you to review. It should be familiar for what we talked about in the monthly process, but you can always go back here and see an acronym in case you have any questions. So jumping in, so again, just a quick high-level background about what this project is. This slide should look familiar as we did discuss this in the monthly process. So for background, remember we talked about how with supply shortfalls across the Western interconnection, they're contributing to the increased dependency on import generation to serve that load reliability. It is critical that both the internal and external load serving entities that the ISO establish a proper framework of market scheduling priorities for wheeling through transactions in our BAA. This project introduces a design to identify the available transfer capability, that ATC, that can be allocated to priority wheeling through that PWT that you'll see across the system. This project also provides an opportunity for external entities to drive transmission upgrades across the ISO system to support a wheeling through. So currently, load has the priority to ATC at an intertie, and this project gives the wheel through schedule the same priority to that ATC. So for this training specifically, we are going to be talking about the daily increments, that 7-day horizon. I also have linked here PRR 1560. That was linked in our previous presentation as well. And throughout these slides, I will have other PRRs linked that I'll make sure to call attention to for you to review. So now that we have the background about this project at a very high level, I do want to talk about that implementation timeline. So far, we had our external training for the monthly process that happened at the end of February. You should have just wrapped up market simulation if I am correct. And now we're going to be heading towards that implementation of that monthly process. So currently we're now talking about the daily process happening today in our training. I want to call attention to market simulation. So there has been a change in that starting time for market simulation. It was originally, I believe, starting next week on the 8th, and we have pushed it to 4:15. And I'll have details in the later slides, and we can have Q&A about market simulation when we get to that section. And then you'll see we still have that production activation on 6/1. Linked at the bottom of this page, again, this project has a lot of moving parts. I wanted to link the policy initiative page so you can go back and see, whether it be for the monthly training or other slides that are correlated to this topic. So now that we talked about the implementation timeline, we're refreshed about why we're here today. Let's do a refresher about what we talked about last time. So the first thing we talked about as a group was we talked about, okay, how do we get access to this application web wheel? What is our first step in this process? And that would be registering in Masterfile. So we talked about if you're already registered, you're good to go to the next step, which I'll talk about here in a second. But if you need to register, you'll register through that new Intertie resource request template. And so as a reminder, the ISO asked users to submit 11 business days in advance. However, there's no upper limit. You can submit as early as you want, as long as you indicate the correct effective date. Masterfile will accommodate that. I've also included a slide here just to show you where that's located and to remind you that you can submit that via city and we can get you registered. So after you've registered and you've done the first step of Masterfile, the next step would be to provision an AIM. So working with your UAA to provision WebWheel access. Again, this is already existing scheduling contract types, as I have listed on the screen. I do want to call attention that there are two different roles to this. So there's a read-only and a read-write. You want to make sure that you work with your UAA to get the correct role privilege as you're going through WebWheel. So we talked about Masterfile. You've either registered or you're good to go. And now you've been provisioned through AIM. And now let's talk about some of the other topics that were covered in our monthly process. You'll see here I have linked the training to that presentation. So if you do want to go back, you can look at that at your leisure. But we did talk about WebWheel. So we talked about this new application. We went over how to submit a power contract, requesting PWT, and then viewing those awards as well. In SIRA, we talked about that new screen, the native load needs. The SIRA user guide has been updated to include this screen, and it's going to be section 3.13, which I've linked here in this presentation. The next thing that we talked about is cyber, which will look very familiar to what we talk about today. I've called attention to that user guide, section 3.2.8, for you to go and look through. We talked about OASIS, so there's a new report in OASIS, the ATC for PWT requests, which is housed under that transmission tab. And then the last thing we talked about is settlements. So we talked about the wheeling access charge, what's impacted. We walked through a couple of examples, and that will look very similar to what we talk about today. So I did a recap and an overview of the project. I do want to pause before we start talking about newer things, just to see if folks have any questions. So I'll pass it over to you, Mo, to see what questions we have.
Hey, Dottie. I do see we have a question in the chat from Jarek Fisher from SRP. His question states, when attempting to use the web wheel to create the web request for different months, why does it slowly say show the 08-2024 submission window is currently not open? It will open on 6/17/2024 at 12 a.m.
That is a great question. I'm going to see if one of my SMEs, I'm going to see if Ramesh or Justin are on the call to see if they may have an answer for that. Okay, we can take that back and we'll get that answered for you. And then if we can get that before the end of this training, I'll be sure to follow up on that question.
Thank you, Dottie. And I'm also looking in the other to see if there's any hands raised. And again, as a reminder, if you have a question you'd like to ask, feel free to raise your hand by using the virtual hand icon, and we will either unmute you or you can unmute yourself. At this time, Dottie, I don't see any hands raised. Actually, we have another question in the chat, and this one comes from Jordan. Jordan asks, under what category is the ATC for PWT request found?
That is a great question. I believe my next section will answer this. If it doesn't, we'll come back and answer that as well. Perfect. Thank you so much, Mike. It'll be under transmission. Yep. Okay, so we can go forward and talk about some of the new stuff. Thank you so much for those questions. So today we are going to be talking about settlements, OASIS, Cyber, and WebWheel, and as it relates to the daily process. The first we'll talk about is WebWheel. It's a bigger chunk of today's training. We're going to walk through requesting the priority wheeling through, that PWT for the daily process. Now this process will look almost identical to the monthly process, except there is going to be a few things, and I'll call your attention to what those categories are, that'll be different from that original process. We're also going to understand the capacity release functionality, and then we're going to review 2 reports. So we have a PWT position report, and we have a contract utilization report. Now, those 2 things at the bottom aren't necessarily tied to the daily process. However, we did want to include it in this training for your awareness, and so you can start exploring in that. So again, that first thing we're going to talk about is submitting a PWT request and viewing awards. Now, during the monthly process, you have registered power contracts. You do not need to do that for this process because you've already done it. You definitely can. However, you can just continue to use the contracts that you've registered previously. So once you log into WebWheel, it's going to bring you to your participant dashboard, and just a high-level refresher again. So you log in, you see the submission window. It's going to provide that summary of where we are in that process. We have the news and announcements and activity logs, so it just updates you about what's happening in the app. We have our PWT request count, so this is going to show your request, what was submitted into the system. And then, of course, we have our records section, so it's just a summary of your information. And just as a reminder, WebWheel is going to be just your information as a participant. It's not going to show other folks' information. So as we go in and before we start submitting, we're going to talk about that submission window. So for the daily process, the daily HCC request window is open for 5 hours during the hours of 7 a.m. to noon, every day across the rolling 7-day horizon for which daily HCC is calculated. So participants can create requests no earlier than 2 days in advance and receive results by 1 p.m. A PWT request for 2 days in advance will receive the reward at 1 p.m. and will have until the close of the day ahead market the next day to submit their bids. So I do have an example here on the screen about the trade date Monday 3/25. So you can request between 3/27 and 4/1. You can assume that the daily request for 3/27 is accepted and awarded, which would then lead to the results published on 3/25 at 1 p.m. And then if we look to Tuesday 3/26, you'll see that the day ahead market for operating date 3/27 closes at 10 a.m. Now, I do have more details in the appendix. I will go over maybe if you want to see a couple more dates on how this will look. So you can go look at that and see if you have any questions. So just like last time, when the submission window opens, you're going to go to the Operations tab in WebWheels, and you're going to select PWT Requests. Once you select that, it's going to bring you to this landing page. So you may already see a PWT request for the monthly process that you submitted. So you'll want to start a new one, which is that little page icon in the right-hand corner that'll select, yes, I do want to select a new request. Once you select that, it's going to do a pop-up, and the form is going to look almost identical to what you do for the monthly process, except you're going to be filling this out for the daily. So for period type, you'll see again, monthly or daily. Because it's daily, I would suggest you select daily. After you've done that, it's going to bring you to the participant, contract, import, enter tie, export, enter tie, and product. So again, this should look familiar to what you did previously. So the participant and contract are going to be a drop-down menu. You'll select what contract and participant you want to have for this request. Once you fill that out, it's going to automatically filter the import, enter tie, export, enter tie, and product that are associated with that contract. Now you are able to change your product if you want to, if you didn't want to go what was on the contract, and that'll be a drop-down box as well. After you have navigated and you have figured out, okay, this is the contract I want to put this request for, you're going to move on to periods. So you'll see that periods, when you click on it, it's also a drop-down box that filters between single day, date range, and weekly. And so for the daily process, you can select up to the 7-day range. And it's suggested that for a market simulation, it might be easiest to do date range just because you have more control. However, you are able to use any of these options as it relates to the parameters of the daily process. So after you've decided, okay, I know what periods I want to do, I've selected the date range that's in accordance to the market simulation activities, you're going to move on to profile type. And so these next slides are identical to what we talked about in the monthly process. So just as a refresher, profile type, you have two options. You have a flat, which is going to be a constant megawatt that you're going to submit. You'll see that the system is going to tell you how many remaining capacity megawatts you have, and you can go based off that for your request. Now, if you decide you want to do the other option, which is variable, it's going to have this pop-up window for you to submit. Again, you can do different megawatts across the days, whatever you desire for that as well. So after you've decided, okay, which profile type do I want, you'll move down to the accept pro rata and accept partial. So just again, as a refresher, and I have examples in the appendix if you wanted to look through those as well, but if you were to select accept pro rata, this means that requests can be awarded up to the requested amount for the evaluation period, so that subset of megawatts. If you decide not to check it, this just means that requests must be awarded for the full amount for the evaluation period. Now, if you go down to accept partial, if you were to select yes, this just means that requests can be awarded for each period included in the request duration, so that subset of months. If you decide, nope, I don't want to accept partial, this will mean that requests must be awarded the same amount for all periods of the request. So after you've decided, okay, I am going to accept both or accept neither, or whatever you decide, and you're confident and ready to move forward, you'll hit the save button, and it's going to bring you back to that landing page, so the PWT request summary. You'll notice the status column will either have processed, it'll have awarded, rejected, and you'll go through and you'll see, okay, if it's processing, that's great. If it's rejected, I maybe need to go in and edit something or fix something. And then you'll see later on awarded, and you'll move on to that next step, which is to review the PWT awards. The way you'll get to that is the operations tab. It's right under the request, which is nice. So you'll select that, and it'll bring you to that landing page, which has your participant, your contract, and other details as it relates to your PWT awards. So next, I'm going to stop here before we move on to capacity release. And I just want to see what questions folks have about the daily process and how it relates to submit your PWT request. So Mo, I will pass it over to you to see what questions we may have.
Thank you, Dottie. I'm not seeing any new questions in the chat at this time, and I'm not seeing any hands raised. I'm just going to give it a second to see if anybody else has any questions. Nope, there's no further questions. Dottie, back to you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Mo. So the next section we'll be talking about today is capacity release. Now, just as a reminder, this isn't directly tied to the daily process. This is just a process that we wanted to inform you of so you have awareness and you can look at this field inside of WebWheel itself. So the way you're going to get to capacity release is it's going to be on the data tab. So all the other tabs should look familiar to you as we went through them in our first training. And you'll just see at the bottom capacity releases. And this is going to just be information for you on your contract capacity reductions and your contract terminations. So I wanted to make sure that we define what capacity release is and you have an understanding of that before we go into an example of submitting one. So just as a background, capacity release is the act of releasing PWT ATC back to the market. So what that means, it's decreasing the PWT positions. Now, in releasing this back, the PWT ATC back into the market, the following rules do apply to this. So the first one will be, if it is found that the contracted megawatt becomes less than the awarded PWT megawatt positions, then the user must reduce the awarded PWT megawatt positions to the contracted megawatts. The second one is going to be, if it is found that the contracted service hours become shorter than the awarded PWT service hours, then the user is going to cut short that PWT position to fit the new contracted service hours. And then the last item is if it is found that the contract duration, so from that start date to the end date, becomes shorter than the awarded PWT, then we're going to cut short the PWT positions to fit the new contract period. Now, I do want to point out that users must notify the ISO no later than 11 days before the start of the changed contract. And I'll talk about what that looks like here in just a moment about how you'll go about doing that. I also want to point out, so when does this occur? When is this happening? This is going to be in the future time horizon, so that not yet executed market timeline, and it is not applicable to release PWT ATC for the already executed PWT awards, so in the market time that has already passed. So now that we have a broad understanding, I want to dive a little bit deeper and narrow our lens a little bit about what this looks like in WebWheel and how you will do this if you decide to do a capacity release. So this is the summary page. So again, after you go to the data tab, you'll scroll down to the capacity release, and it's going to bring you to the capacity release summary. So this is, again, just similar to the other pages you see in WebWheel. It's going to be a high-level overview of what requests you've put in, whether it be a contract termination or a capacity reduction. Again, very similar to the other pages, in order to select and request a new one, you're going to that page icon that'll be in the right-hand side, and that just indicates that, yes, I do want to select a new application. Once you hit the new icon, it's going to bring you to this form, so the new capacity release. Similar to other items that you've done inside WebWheel, you're going to see a participant and a contract. Those are drop-down boxes that you'll select depending on what contract you would like to do either the release or the termination for. Once you decide, okay, this is the contract and the participant I would like to do this for, you'll then decide, do I want to do a contract termination or do I want to do a contract capacity reduction? And we'll go through these in just one second, but again, just want to call attention, I mentioned this in the previous slide. So for both of these options, you must notify the ISO no later than the 11 days before the start of the change. And the way you're going to do this is we're still actually figuring this out, whether it's going to be through the UI or a different process. And this will be communicated with you later on as we go about doing this. So we can first start, just because I believe it's a little bit more complex, is the contract capacity reduction. It has a little bit more moving parts, where the termination is pretty straightforward. So we'll start with the contract capacity reduction first. So after you've selected, okay, the release type I would like to do is that, it's going to bring up this pop-up box. So it'll show the original contract period that is associated, and then it's going to show you the contract capacity. So it shows the month, the original capacity megawatt, the modified capacity megawatt, the awarded megawatt, that modified award megawatts, and you'll see the number and the total, the awarded megawatt mismatch, and the released ATC megawatt. Now, as this is a new table, I do want to dive a little bit deeper about what does that mean when you say modified capacity megawatt, just so we all have an understanding together before we do an example. So just to break this down, so if you look at the column for original capacity megawatt, this just means these are the megawatts the ISO has awarded users. If we go next to it and we see the modified capacity megawatt, what this means is this is how many megawatts participants wanted to change their amount to. So this is the action that you will be doing as we do a capacity contract reduction. The awarded megawatt, so this is what you're going to end up being receiving. So this is the award that you end up getting. You'll notice the modified award megawatt. So these are the PWT awards that you can modify to fit your contract. And I'll show you how to modify those here in just one moment. The award mismatch, so that megawatt, is going to indicate how many megawatts need to be reduced, which again will make sense when we go through an example together. And then that last column is the released ATC megawatt. So this is indicating you've done the process and it's showing how many megawatts you've released back into the system. So now that we all have an understanding at a high level about this table, let's go through an example together so we can get a little bit more comfortable with this terminology. So I made this table. It's identical to what you'll see in WebWheel. It's just a little bit easier to maneuver and do an example with you guys. So let's first go through the contract capacity reduction example. So this is an example where, yes, you will be making a change. So hypothetically, a participant is awarded 352 megawatts. So remember, this is what the users will end up receiving. Something occurs where, for some reason, maybe no longer they need a larger number. So they've modified their capacity to 300, which is going to leave a negative 52 megawatt difference. So the modified capacity is less than that awarded megawatt. So then, yes, we will need to do a capacity reduction. So as they do this, I want to point out, you'll notice that the award megawatt mismatch is negative 52, and that's showing, okay, yes, we need to get rid of that 52 megawatt difference. And at the end, we'll want it to read as a 0. And for the released ATC megawatts, currently it's a 0, but we want that to be a 52 to show that, yes, we have released that 52 megawatts. That is the difference. So the way you're going to go about doing this is you're going to look at your awards. So the awards labeled 100238 all the way to 100254, those are just titles for your PWT awards. And you're going to decide, okay, where am I going to take out 52 megawatts from this? Again, this is up to the user to decide, and they can figure out how they want to subtract it, whether it be across all 3 or just across 2, it just depends. So for this example, I've decided, okay, the easiest way for me to do this, and it makes sense for my organization, is we're going to just make this 50 a 0, and that just gets rid of 50 altogether, so it makes it a little bit easier. You'll notice once I enter a 0 to get rid of the 50 award, the award megawatt mismatch will now be -2 because I got rid of 50, and then the released ATC megawatt will show that 50 that I released. So then I think to myself, okay, I still have -2. I have 2 megawatts that I need to figure out of the other 2 awards that I have. I need to take away 2 megawatts. So I could either do 1 from each, or I could just do 2. And that's what I decide. So I look at my award for the 7, and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to subtract the 2 remaining megawatts from this. I'm going to make it a 5, and it's going to show my award mismatch now a 0, and the released ATC megawatt a 52. So as you go through this, you will realize you are successful in this when the award mismatch is 0 and your released ATC shows that amount indicated in the release. So that is an example at a pretty basic high-level overview of a contract capacity reduction. Now let's do one more just as another hypothetical. So hypothetically, a participant is awarded 300 megawatts. Something occurs where maybe they look at their modified capacity and they modify it to 315. So now they just have 15 megawatts that are extra. Because it's not negative and the modified capacity is higher than the awarded, you're not going to have to go in and change any of your awards because you're still good to go. So that was the avenue for doing a capacity reduction, whether it be you have to change your awards or you don't have to. I'll quickly show you the contract termination. Again, it is a little bit more straightforward because you're not having to do math. So you'll go to the release type, you'll fill out the information just like you did for the contract capacity reduction, and then it's going to bring you a similar page. So what you'll do for this is the awards will just need to be set to 0, and then you'll update the contract, and the web wheel will check the positions and readjust them for any violations. So it's just making those awards that were in there 0. Now, before I pause for questions, I will just quickly go over these 2 reports, and then we'll come back and see if folks have questions about capacity release. So these 2 reports are located inside of WebWheel. It's the PWT position and the contract utilization reports. So the way you're going to get to this is the reports tab, and then you'll see both of those reports right there for you. Let's first look at just high level, the PWT position. So this is what that report will look like, except it'll have your information in there. And it's just going to give you a high-level overview of the PWT positions at a glance. So you'll notice the participant, the direction, and then that profile section should look familiar for what we just talked about, that capacity release. So you'll see contract capacity, requested, awarded, remaining, and then a few other details that I've blurred out because it's proprietary, but it'll be your information. And then the other one is that contract utilization report. So again, this should also look familiar to you. It provides a little bit more detail as it relates to your contract. So you'll see your name, your participant, the product, the period end and start date, and then more details as it relates to your PWT requests. So I'll pause here now and see what questions folks have, whether about these reports or about the PWT capacity release. And I'll pass it over to you, Mo, to see if we have anything in the chat or any hands raised.
Thank you again, Dottie. At this time, I'm not seeing any new questions in the chat. Again, please feel free to add your question in the chat. And if you don't have any questions now but have questions later, you're more than welcome to email us later. Also, I'm checking to see if there's any hands raised. I'm not seeing any at this time. You do have the option to use the hand raise icon to ask your questions. But at this moment, hearing none, seeing none, Dottie, back to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mo. So the next section that we'll be talking about, so we just talked about WebWheel. We talked about the daily PWT request. We looked at capacity release, and then those 2 reports that you can play around with. The next sections are going to be about things that should look familiar to the monthly process, and will also just be a high-level refresher for you as we go through this next market simulation. So the first thing I'll talk about is cyber. So we're just going to recap the expectations in cyber. The first is to review the cyber user guide for 3.2.8. I also have slides in the appendix, I believe, a link to the first training that was given for this. And it just indicates that there's no UI changes and just gives a high-level overview of that. Additionally, for cyber, so background information, again, the slides should look familiar. So when it's time to be awarded that PWT, the results are sent from WebWheel to cyber to be stored and validated. And what you'll be doing is just validating that. So again, the resource import and export belong to the same contract, and that is scheduled for the wheeling transaction. And I have an additional example in our appendix that talk about how there can only be 1 counter resource per wheeling transaction for the trading hour. So the next section I'll talk about is OASIS. This should also look very familiar to you. Again, it's just a review of the ATC for PWT requests. So where it's going to be located is on OASIS under the Transmission tab. It'll show ATC for PWT requests. I have linked here in this training the PRR 1558 for the Market Operations BPM that just breaks this down a little bit more for you to look at your leisure. So after you have selected this tab, this page, you are going to be going to, it'll bring you to this landing page, the ATC for PWT request. And then for the horizon at the top, you'll just navigate that to daily and hit apply, and it should filter for the daily process. I did want to point out that this report displays the current plus that rolling window. So you'll see things on here like the PWT ATC, which is the ATC that is used for the CAP awarding PWT. You'll see PWT is the ATC capacity that was previously awarded for the priority wheeling PWT request. You'll see available transfer capability, and I have a little asterisk to explain how that includes ETC, which elaborates more in the BPM, the PRR. There's also the total transfer capability, which is the TTC. You should be familiar with the native load needs if you do this for NLN, and then the transmission reliability margin, which is the TRM. Now I have linked here is the tech spec, so this was with the monthly process, but I did want to carry it over if you did not get a chance to look at that, so you can just go back and click that link and it'll bring you right to it. So if you would like to download this, you are able to, so the daily group zip will contain the data for the selected date for that one date. Now remember, each day will have its own file and it's going to mirror the UI report. In the appendix, I did include an example of the daily and the monthly process, a hypothetical, if you will, that talks about what it might look like when you download a certain file, either for the daily or the monthly. So again, I'm just going to pause here before we talk about settlements, and I just want to see if folks have questions about the OASIS report or any other questions that they might have, and I'll pass it over to you, Mo.
Thank you again, Dottie. I'm not seeing any new questions in the chat. Jared, just want to let you know that we are still working on getting you an answer for your initial questions or your initial question. And at this time, I'm not seeing any hands raised either. So just then pause for a couple seconds just to give you some time. All right, Dottie, back to you.
Thank you so much, Mo. I really appreciate it. Okay, so this next section, we're going to talk about settlements, and we're just going to review settlement impacts for this as we go through it. Again, for this market simulation, there will be settlement impacts, and I'll just indicate what that looks like for you. So if we jump first, and I also have in the appendix I break down the calculation a little bit more as someone myself who, when I look at a calculation, it can be a little much. So I just tried to break it down to make it a little bit easier to read or to glance at, if you will, if you didn't want to spend time navigating through that calculation. So the wheel export quantity pre-calculation has been modified. So it's modified to include the resale calculation in the original PWT transaction, as well as other existing export quantity calculations. So you'll see that this is going to indirectly impact two charge codes, so two charge allocations. So it'll be the high voltage wheeling axis charge allocation 382, and then the low voltage wheeling axis charge allocation 383. So those are the two that you'll be seeing. And then the way you'll review this is the WAC charge for the PWT ATC awards on the settlement statement. Now we do have a PRR linked here on this. It's PRR 1560. And it'll go into more details again about the settlements and billing as it relates to this specific project. In our last training together for the monthly process, I did put examples together of what this could look like for you. And I have them linked at the end of this training, but I did just want to do maybe a high-level summary of what this looks like. So for example, if an entity's actual schedule is less than the awarded PWT capacity, then the entity will pay the WAC on the awarded capacity rather than its actual schedule. So this will be that new requirement that WAC is charged against wheeling through capacity if its schedule is less. Now, another take is if an entity's actual schedule is greater than the awarded PWT capacity, then the entity would pay WAC on the actual schedule. And this is already a current practice that WAC is charged against the wheeling through schedules. So again, in a combination with the new requirement that I just talked about and that current practice, we will be paying the maximum of the two, whether that be the PWT awarded capacity or the PWT actual export schedule. And again, if you're someone who maybe needs a little bit more visuals and a refresher, I do have those examples at the end of this training in the appendix. So I'll pause again here and see if folks have questions about settlements, about those examples. And I'll open up the floor for you, Mo, to see if we have any hands raised.
Thank you, Dottie. We do have a question from Chen Yu Lo. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Chen Yu.
Good morning. This is Chen Yu Lo from PG&E. Thanks, Dottie, for all this good information. Can you go back to page 60, please? I think I have one question there. Maybe one more. Maybe 59. Yes, over here. So seeing in the middle there, a variable transfer capability, ATC, and there's an asterisk there, say includes ETC. Can you elaborate a little bit here? What does that mean?
Yes, and I know one of the things I was working on this with is out of office, but I'll pass it over to the other, if Mike, if you're on the call, if you have any additional information we can add, and if not, I can follow up with that and get that back to you, Chen Yu.
That would be great.
Of course, yep.
Thanks.
Hello, sorry, I missed the question.
Can we restate it?
A recap, so, yep, I can restate it if you'd like, I believe I understand it. For the available transfer capability, that ATC, we have an asterisk that includes ETC. And I know I talked with another SME about including that asterisk, and I wasn't sure if you would also know, Mike, more information on that, or if I should reach out to the person I worked with.
You mean in terms of displaying ETC at some point, or verifying that the ATC value includes ETC?
Yeah, the latter.
Yes, ATC value does include ETC in that calculation.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for that question, Chen Yu.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. Thank you, Jarrett, for that response. We'll follow up with the city ticket. Does not look like we have anyone else with their hands raised. So Back to you, Dottie.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So now that we've gone through that information, I do want to talk about market simulation activities, and we can have a little bit of an open discussion as that date did change recently. So just at a high level, this daily process will be an unstructured guided market simulation that starts on April 15th. I've included that scenario here in the document, as well as a link back to the document as well in our release planning page. I believe they'll also be going over more information in Market Simulation Forum itself, and we can also reach out and I can provide additional information as it relates to this. We also have, if you have questions about the functional environment options, you can submit a city ticket. And I'll come back here and pause to see if folks have questions, or I believe, Trang, you're also on the call. If you wanted to add anything about market simulation, I could pass it over to you as well. Okay, so I see Trang's audio may not be connected, so we can reach out to her with that question, but I'll pass it over to you, Mo, to see if folks do have questions before I go forward.
Thank you, Dottie. Let me just scan through just to make sure we didn't. There is a question from Ben who has his hand raised. Ben, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, I have a question with regards to settlements. Talking about the WAC charges, is there a congestion charge included in the priority wheel through, or is congestion waived?
That is a great question. I believe I know the answer, but I do want to point back to my SME so I don't misspeak. For anyone from the CAISO side that could speak to that, if not, I can reach out to that specific SME. Okay, it looks like I will need to reach out to him. We have a few folks out, so I'll take that back. I believe the answer is no, but I'll include that when I send out my review of this meeting. So I'll have those questions, and then I'll just recap a few others that were mentioned. I know, Chen Yu, you asked a verbal question. You got the answer, but I'll make sure to include that in the summary as well.
Thank you.
Of course, yep. Well, were there any other questions, hands raised, or? Oh, perfect.
It does not look like we have any other questions, but I did see there may be a response from Mike Rue, and I'll include that in the chat in a few minutes to answer the recent question. So outside of that, I'm not seeing any new questions or hands raised at this time. Back to you, Dottie.
Okay, perfect. So we are wrapping up again. I figured we might go through this a little bit quick because it is a lot of just a refresher and maybe a few new things, but I did want to include this time just in case we had a lot of questions or folks wanted to dive a little bit deeper. So just as a reminder, so if you have a moment today, I'll be sending out a survey as well as those questions that you asked. I'll make sure to include it in my email. If you could take the survey and just let us know how we're doing, it's a great opportunity for us to review it and improve. We do want to make these trainings better and as most effective as possible. So when you come in here, you're learning as much as possible. And as well, I just want to thank you again for your time this morning. I'm glad to give you some of your time back. If you have questions about anything that was presented today in this training, please send an email over to customerreadiness@CAISO.com. And then again, if you have any other questions, maybe about the stakeholder specific question or concerns, you can always submit a city ticket. And then I'll pause here again just to see if folks have any other questions. And Mo, if you have anything else that you'd like to add.
Thank you, Dottie. Again, our SMEs are currently still working on the response. Most likely we'll share the response after this call in an email that Dottie will be sending out. Outside of that, Dottie, I'm not seeing any other hands raised or any new questions in the chat at this time. So back to you, Dottie.
Okay, perfect. And I did see the other question about confirming trade dates. I will include that in the summary of this training, just so you have that as well. And I know it's Thursday, yeah, so later in today's call for market simulation, there'll be more information there as well for you. But again, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time this morning, and I will send you that email shortly. So have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.